tonight, did anything he did tonight assuage some of your concerns about his candidacy?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Ali, that he was certainly steadier in this interview than we saw him in the debate, and even more so, I think, at the rally in the afternoon before he gave this interview today. At the same time, the overwhelming impression that I got from this is that you have a president that's basically in denial. Denial about the decline that people can clearly see. They asked him, well, you know, have you declined in the last 3.5 years since you became president? And you know, he seems to suggest that he hasn't. Denial about the polling, about how far behind, especially as George Stephanopoulos pointed out, in these battleground states, how far behind he is. Denial about the drumbeat of support for asking him to step aside. Now, 4 congressional representatives and Senator Warner as well. He seemed to dismiss that and said, only if the Lord Almighty comes down will I, would I step aside. And then maybe most importantly, and I think the most chilling, when Stephanopoulos asked him, well, what if you lose to Donald Trump? Then how are you going to feel? And President Biden said, well, as long as I gave it my all, that basically that he would feel okay. That's not good enough for the American people. That's not good enough with the stakes of Donald Trump winning. What people want is to have confidence that whoever Democrats put up can win this election. So I think he did better tonight, but I think he's got a long way to go to show folks, to give people confidence that he can actually beat Donald Trump.
Basil, earlier before this interview, we were listening to the president's rally, in which he was on. He was the guy he would like the viewers to believe he is. And he often addresses his age, perhaps more so than even the media does. Let's listen to what he said when he was talking about, am I too old to do this? Let's listen.
Are you the same man today that you were when you took office 3.5 years ago?
In terms of successes, yes. I also was the guy who put together a peace plan for the Middle East that may be coming to fruition. I was also the guy that expanded NATO. I was also the guy that grew the economy. All the individual things that were done were ideas I had or I fulfilled. I moved on. And so, for example, well, that was true then. What's Biden done lately? Today, just announced 200,000 new jobs. We're moving in a direction that no one's ever taken on. I know you know this from the days in the government. I took on Big Pharma. I beat them. No one said I could beat them. I took on all the things we said we got done. We were told we couldn't get done. And part of it is what I said when I ran was I wanted to do 3 things. Restore some decency to the office, restore some support for the middle class instead of trickle-down economics, both from the middle out and the bottom up. That way the wealthy still do fine, everyone does better, and unite the country.
He didn't get a lot of opportunities to talk about substance and the issues. George was quite on message about his fitness for the job. That was one answer in which he was able to start to touch on, here's what I've done, and then he gave another answer in talking about what he's going to do. Right. Do you think that had much of an effect?
I do think it has an effect because, as he said, in terms of my successes, nothing's changed. I'm the same person. And you start talking about the cost of insulin. You start talking about jobs. You actually start going through the record. And you're like, you know what? This person's done actually a really good job as president. And so, just to pivot off of a point that Secretary Castro made, if we're talking about issues of confidence, how do we get there? One way that we get there, in my view, and I've been very sort of forthright about this, is to have the kind of message discipline that we see the Republicans have on the other side. I'm not saying we should be like them, but what I am saying is that if you go to a Republican and talk to them about Donald Trump's convictions or his trials, they're like, what are you talking about? We know nothing about what you're talking about. And then solidly behind that guy, we seem to be having a broader conversation about who is fit for us to move forward. And even if you want to have that conversation internally, how do you sow within the voter a question and concern about your thinking through whether or not he should be allowed to move forward? Right. Because you're having this conversation openly, and it says to the voter that the Democrats don't know what they're doing. They don't have a plan. And that when people say that Democrats are too soft, this is exactly what they're talking about. if you have this concern about Joe Biden, get everybody together, make a decision. He can get out on his own terms, and he's earned the right to do that. And then you go tell us who we're going to get behind that person. Now, the party's not always built for that. And because we're a month from the convention, that's going to be messy. But the point is, if you're looking for something in this interview to give you a little more faith and a little more hope, I think you'll find it. But the truth is that the discipline of the party in getting the voters to a place where they can feel confident in their decision-making is what's going to actually move us even more forward.
Secretary Castro, let's talk about that for a second. Basil makes the point that the Democratic Party of today is not the Republican Party of today. The Republican Party of today is a cult. They're pretty aligned on messaging, generally speaking, and these internal disputes, one would wish they would happen more with a guy like Donald Trump at the helm. They don't happen. What does it tell you about the Democratic Party? Is it a flaw or is it a strength that the Democratic Party is having this discussion right now?
Well, I think ultimately, Ali, that it is a strength. We're not a cult. We are people that are thinking about what's best, not just for the party, but best for the country. It's also a party that is very, very motivated by defeating Donald Trump in November. That's why Joe Biden got elected in 2020. People had confidence that he was the one out of all of those 24 candidates that could get out there and beat Donald Trump. He did it. They don't share that same confidence, unfortunately, in 2024, and we have to contend with that. And I think the entire conversation we're having right now is a conversation that's being had because there's actually still an opportunity as we head toward the convention in August to do something about it. It might be different if we were within the last 4 weeks or so of the election, but we're not there yet. And Democrats want to make sure that they're fielding the strongest candidate to go up against Donald Trump and win in November.
I want to ask my control room if they've got that clip of Joe Biden at the rally today talking about whether he's too old. If they've got that, go ahead and play that.
You think I'm too old to restore Roe v. Wade, the law of the land? You think I'm too old to ban assault weapons again? To protect Social Security and Medicare? To get child care, elder care for working families who need the nation? To make billionaires finally start to pay something beyond 8.2% of the tax rate? Let me ask you, you think I'm too old to beat Donald Trump? I can hardly wait.
So, Basil, in the last 8 days, we've seen sort of three versions of Joe Biden, right? There was the debate version, which even he admits was not a great iteration of him. There was tonight's conversation that both Aaron and the Secretary have pointed out. There's some things that did happen and didn't happen. And then there was that version. And he pointed out to George Stephanopoulos in the interview that he did 10 events right after the debate, including other rallies. If people saw that rally version of him, do you think a lot of concerns will be laid to rest?
I think so. Listen, if enthusiasm is the issue and his ability to generate that kind of enthusiasm on the campaign trail, put him in front of a crowd, have him do exactly what he did in that rally. I don't care if he has to read off a teleprompter. There are going to be opportunities where he can have conversations with reporters that are not on teleprompter. He has the opportunity to have these one-offs, but the campaign should, and I'm sure they are at some point, particularly after all of this, but find his sweet spot. Find that part of him that gets energized and motivated when he's talking about himself and his record and the American people. And that's what I think we saw today. We saw that earlier in the week in North Carolina, and just do more of that. There are surrogates, and including the vice president herself, who can go into the communities in smaller rooms and do the kind of persuasion that I think needs to happen among some Democrats, but certainly independents at this moment in time, to do that kind of reassurance. But if the goal, part of the goal, is to see the president in a place of coming from a place of strength, then do more of that.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.